Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our first public lecture for this academic year. It gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker, Professor Dr. Reinhold Bernhardt. Reinhold Bernhardt is currently a professor for systematic theology and dogmatics at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He has taught at several German and international universities in Heidelberg, Osnabrück, and was a visiting scholar at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and since 2001 he is at Basel. His theological work has grappled with tough theological issues and problems such as the absoluteness of Christianity, the providence of God, or what does it mean to say that God acts, as well as the theology of religions. And he has published several books and numerous articles, more than 70, on these and other topics. His most recent book from 2021 is in the area of Christology, entitled in English, God's Representative, Christology in the Context of a Theology of Religions. We asked him to address us on a topic that he has worked on, music and art as media in interreligious encounters, mainly because of our context in Lebanon and the Middle East, where interreligious dialogue is high on our agenda. We are eager to hear what he has to say about this topic, how we can learn, benefit from that in our encounters here, and how we can compare and contrast the Western experience in this domain with ours. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Reinhold Bernhardt.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabra, for your kind introduction, and all the more for having us, our group, as guests here at the Nest. We appreciate it very much. You already helped us preparing that fascinating trip, and you spent, I think it was Monday morning, the whole morning with us, giving us an overview on the history of the Nest and its development. Then I have to thank very much Dr. Rima. Where is she? Here she is. Thanks a lot. I think it was on Sunday, or it was on Saturday, I think it was, when you showed us around at the beginning of the mosque. We visited the Greek Orthodox Church, the Greek Catholic Church. Yesterday we spent the day in Byblos. You gave us many very important insights. Thank you very much for that. And last night we had again fascinating lecture on the history of the ecumenical movement here in the Near East by Dr. Habib Badr. So we enjoyed it very much being here, and on behalf of our whole group, I would thank you very much for the hospitality you showed us. As you, and now you give me the opportunity to lecture on that topic, and to be honest, I was a bit surprised that you selected this topic, music and art as media of interreligious relations. I sometimes used to distinguish between what I call a hard dialogue and a soft dialogue. Hard interreligious dialogue is a dialogue where you have to negotiate conflicting interests between religious communities, or where you debate truth claims. And soft dialogue is the type of dialogue where it's important to get in touch with each other, to have an encounter, to foster interreligious understanding. And this topic is rather the type of soft dialogue, and I expect that the hard dialogue is much more important for you. So all the more I look forward discussing with you and listening to how you respond to what I present to you now. It is very obvious that relationships, and the same applies for interreligious relationships, are established and shaped by media of communication. And in terms of interreligious relations, verbal and literal communication have been in the foreground so far. The dialogue projects and programs launched by the churches and also by political authorities and by NGOs mostly had the character of verbal conversations. Especially in interreligious grassroots work, however, the focus on verbal conversation proved to be too narrow. Other forms of interreligious encounter and other media for cultivating relations gained in importance. Participation in religious and social events of another religious community, for example, or joint celebrations, visiting holy sites of other religious groups, for instance. Aesthetic media, painting, visual art, music seemed to be more important because they reach deeper levels of understanding, more than verbal conversation could and would do. That also corresponds with a paradigmatic shift, or some paradigmatic shifts in cultural studies. Think of all the turns we had in the cultural studies, the iconic turn, the auditory turn, the aesthetic turn in general. All those turns diverted attention from the media of verbal communication. One can experience and observe a growing attention to bodily experiences, sensations, and states of consciousness as they are expressed in performing rituals, for example. There's even a new branch of research developed called interrituality. The role of music as a driving force for interreligious encounters is highlighted by several scholars of religion today, and many researchers in the field have drawn attention to the important role that music can play in interreligious communication today. Musical practices, they claim, provide a kind of religious language that is perceived as boundary breaking, transcending previously categorical distinctions between the intellectual and the emotional, and enabling innovative cross-denominational and interreligious explorations. While creed and conduct may separate dialogue partners from each other, music can nevertheless offer a common language of spirituality and existential meaning, which remains sensitive to differences and honors the integrity of each partaking individual. Christopher Partridge, who is a co-director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Popular Culture at Lancaster University in England, stated that music has, I quote, the power to extend the natural abilities of the body and the mind, which makes it an apt arena for contemporary religious meaning-making. Music relates to individual emotion and experiences connected to the religious beyond the grand institutional claims, as he puts it, the claims of the religious traditions and groups. Likewise, Lieke Winjai, she's a scholar of art and religion from Utrecht in the Netherlands, stresses, again a quotation, new forms are found to express the experiential and transforming character of sacred claims. And such forms are increasingly connected to making, listening to, or participating in music. People respond to music and use it in a variety of ways as part of their religious practices. Music is a highly personal medium of meaning creation and dialogue. With the inner self as well, dialogue with the inner self as well as with the larger community. And it does not support any, let's say, absolute hierarchy of values. Music can also be deemed as aptly suited for dialogues that reach beyond the boundaries of faith, the boundaries of tradition, the boundaries of religious institutions. One of the critical questions raised against the endeavors of interreligious dialogue, mainly in the intellectual and verbal form, is that those forms of communication, the verbal, the intellectual, are accessible only to religious, well-educated persons, while music and other forms of art do not require certain intellectual capacities. Thus, they are more open to all the members of the religious and even the non-religious communities. To put it succinctly, music and art are not elitist, not only meant for an elite, not elitist, and they reach deeper dimensions of the human personality and community. An example of a music-based intercultural and interreligious encounter is the International Interreligious Music Festival, Musica Sacra International, which took and takes place every 2 years at Whitsun or Pentecost in Marktoberdorf in Bavaria, since its founding in 1992. The primary purpose of it is fostering interreligious understanding. Music is the medium of it. During the 5 days, the 5-day event, which is performed in different locations, in rather spiritual locations like churches, monasteries, mosques, once even in a synagogue. It's also performed in secular institutions like the Bavarian Academy of Music. And it is performed on open-air stages in the city. Vocal ensembles from different cultures and religions perform sacred music there, in these different locations, sacred music from their own tradition. 2 different groups perform in each of the public concerts, so it's kind of music dialogue. Some also participate in the Pentecost services in Marktoberdorf and other towns in the region. In 2014, he was at that time the General Secretary of the WCC, Olaf Fixe-Tveit, had taken over the patronage of the festival, followed by prominent German politicians. Of course, the corona restrictions affected the whole project badly, but it will start again in 2024. While using aesthetic media and forms of aesthetic performance, however, one can ask whether and to what extent they really serve the purpose of interreligious understanding, or whether they offer, at least for the audience, a mere, let's say, folkloristic entertainment. That was one of the points of critique of that festival, isn't it simply folklore? The singers involved certainly will have the opportunity to encounter people from other religions and cultures, but such encounters are and remain mostly episodic. Whether they go beyond the interpersonal relation and change attitudes in regard of other religious traditions, whether a deeper religious understanding and appreciation is achieved is difficult to determine. The crucial question in the background of those reflections is whether music as such has in itself the potential to foster intercultural and interreligious understanding. Today, just before we came here, we visited the Ariane Foundation. Their slogan is "Diversity builds unity." It's the same question. Is it diversity itself which builds unity? Or in the case of the topic of my lecture, is it music itself which builds bridges, which builds unity? Or is it the way the music is performed and received? Is music in itself and of its own right a means of communication and generating of community? Is it in itself able to build bridges over language barriers, cultural differences, religious traditions? Can it influence the cognitive and emotional perception of the culturally and religious other? Or does music rather provide an external occasion that brings people together, who may get involved into verbal communications then? So it's just a frame, the platform. And how is music related to the intellectual content of the religious traditions? Ruth Illman, a scholar from Finland, claims that the intellectual content and the artistic performance, verbal communication and emotional expressiveness, words and melodies are not to be regarded as binary opposites in the context of interreligious encounter. She rather believes that music brings us in contact with a spiritual dimension of reality and thus makes a spiritual communication possible. For her, music has in itself the power to create not only a spiritual communication with the divine, but also spiritual communication across religious boundaries. Music has, according to her understanding, the ability to move the hearts of the listeners, irrespective of their religious and denominational affiliations, in a very tangible, bodily way. Music should not be seen, again, I refer to her understanding, music should not be seen as mere melodizing of theological claims and doctrinal definitions, but as carriers and conveyors of meaning in their own right. Bach's music, for example, is not just the musical version of biblical and theological texts. It expresses meaning in a non-cognitive way and may touch the hearts of Jews and Muslims as well as the hearts of Christians. Is that so? Some even say that we can encounter the voice of God in Bach's music. Does it also apply for Jews? Does it apply for Muslims? I look forward to get your answer to those questions. I leave them for a while open. Ruth Illman doesn't want to disqualify word and text-centered rational dialogue efforts, but rather suggests a more complex, and she calls it a non-binary view of dialogue, where intellectual and emotional, cognitive and embodied dimensions are integrated into a nuanced and comprehensive engagement across religious traditions and communities. She claims that music is not just a tool for interreligious dialogue, but should be acknowledged as dialogue. I hesitate to follow her in that point. As I see it, I'm more cautious. As I see it, it is not the music as such which leads to intercultural and interreligious empathy and understanding on an intellectual and moreover on an emotional level. It is the act of making music and the act of listening to music. So it's the performance of music. Especially for the musicians, music is the occasion and the means of bringing people of different backgrounds together. Making music together is a uniting bond which may lead to a deeper interest in the religious other and in his religious tradition. It provides, as I said, in my understanding, a kind of basis and framework for personal encounter. It allows the musicians to express their identity and their feelings in a more existential manner than words ever would allow it. It can touch their hearts and the hearts of the audience. But I hesitate to attribute a kind of magic power to music itself, as Ruth Illman does. It has, as I see it, it has not a kind of magical power in itself, which overcomes religious and cultural borders. Rather, music can influence how people relate to themselves as well as to the surrounding society, to their bodies and emotions, to profound existential issues and trivial everyday activities and the like. It allows to express and to experience religion in an embodied, emotional, creative way. And as such, it can contribute, in a very important way, can contribute to mutual understanding. But it cannot be regarded as a form of communication in its own right. For me, it is not dialogue in itself. The concept of interreligious dialogue needs to be broadened. This is, for me, no question. The focus on the mere verbal and literal conversation is too narrow. The concept of interreligious dialogue needs to be broadened. One should not think in the first instance of an intellectual dialogue between leaders and experts of religious communities, but moreover on a conversation between ordinary people in everyday life, so what is called the dialogue of life, not the dialogue of teaching or of doctrine. It is not only an act of communication, as I understand in religious dialogue, it is an attitude. It's not only an act, it's an attitude. That attitude can be expressed in different forms of communication. Verbal and non-verbal, rational and emotional, theoretical and practical. Not only the non-verbal and emotional forms of communication are embodied forms of communication. Talking with each other is also a bodily act and not just an intellectual exchange. So the term interreligious dialogue can evoke a too narrow understanding what it means and in which form it occurs. Therefore, I prefer to speak of encounter between adherents of different religious communities and traditions in a dialogical attitude, as opposed to, let's say, for an attitude of enmity or controversy or debate. That attitude can become deepened and amplified by the practice of interreligious encounter, but I doubt that it can become created and constituted by such encounters. It must be there before a person gets involved in the encounter. It is a precondition of the encounter. That attitude is what Bourdieu called habitus, or what Max Weber once called the ethos, as a basic disposition of a person towards other persons, the religious other, as I said. That attitude becomes expressed in the whole behavior and lifestyle of a person. Bourdieu relates the habitus closely to the social status of a person. In regard to interreligious relations, however, that doesn't seem to be an important feature of the habitus concept. A dialogical attitude towards religious alternatives can be developed on the basis of every social status. But of course it needs education, it needs cultivation. More important than the social status of a person is the religious self-understanding of a person or of a group. A dialogical attitude correlates to what one may call a liberal perception of one's own religion, based on a non-exclusivistic understanding of religious truth. According to such an understanding, the truth of one's own religion cannot be identified without any difference, identified with the ultimate truth, which is the property of God's self. So one has to distinguish between the religious truth and the truth, which is God in God's self. As a consequence of those reflections, I doubt whether listening to music and making music oneself really can change one's attitudes toward the religious other and his or her tradition. Contrary to Hillman, I do not regard music as a dynamic force for shaping rational responses, social identification, and emotional attachment to religious contexts, narratives, and worldviews. I go a step further from here. One can ask whether specifically religious music is more likely to bring into interreligious understanding than non-religious music. Or is it, contrary to that assumption, even more appropriate to refrain from religious music and to prefer secular music as a medium for interreligious community building, at least for the musicians involved? Religious music is an expression of different religious identities, while secular music may be regarded as a kind of neutral space in which those differences play no important role. In Weimar, the city in Germany, in Weimar, the Jewish musician, he's a pianist and a director, Daniel Barenboim, initiated the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. You may have heard about it. Weimar is the city where Goethe wrote the West Eastern Divan, a collection of lyrical poems which was inspired by the Persian poet Hafez. The intention of Goethe's work, it was written, I think, from 1814 to 1819, something around that. The intention of Goethe's work was to stimulate the exchange between the Orient and the Occident, the Latin and the Persian culture, Christianity and Islam. In the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, musicians from the Middle East, mainly from Israel and Palestine, are playing together, and they play secular music. Obviously, it is easier for a Jewish musician to play, not to play Muslim music, if there is anything like Muslim music at all. You know, there's an ongoing discussion among Muslims whether music is halal or is haram, so some say, of course, there is Muslim music, others reject that. And for Muslim musicians, it is easier to play Beethoven than Jewish music. So that was the idea of Barenboim. No religious music, secular music. Barenboim said, Barenboim's idea was to foster intercultural and interreligious understanding and he deliberately decided not to use religious music for that purpose. The work of the orchestra and the concerts are intended to create interpersonal relations and stimulate intellectual discussions, but not on the basis of religious music. To train the members of the orchestra, the Barenboim Side Academy was founded in Berlin 2012 by Barenboim and Edward W. Said. You may know him, the American intellectual with Palestinian roots. The Barenboim Said Foundation also supports music projects in Israel and Palestine, such as the Barenboim Said Music Center in Ramallah. Another example of interreligious and intercultural music making is the Israeli heavy metal band Orphaned Land. Is anyone who knows the band? You are not very familiar with heavy metal music. That band combines Jewish influences with Middle Eastern folk music and Arabic traditions. I thought I should choose such an example to get the students in touch with my topic, but obviously it does not work. The lyrics of their songs that promote a message of peace and unity, particularly between Judaism, Islam and Christianity. Their third album, Mahu, the story of the three sons of seven, released in 2004, tells a story of three sons, each of one of the Abrahamic, one for each Abrahamic religion, who try to warn humanity of a flood coming as punishment for their sins. And then the intention of it is to call for a mutual understanding as an alternative to expecting that flood coming. Their music intends a meeting of East and West, past and present, light and darkness. And interestingly, the band, the members of the band have said that they are not religious. The majority of the band members identifies themselves even as atheist or agnostic. But their songs are heavily drawing on biblical themes. Here one even can ask whether the interreligious agenda isn't simply a means of promoting commercial success. It's also an issue. At this point, a further and even more fundamental question occurs. Can music become qualified as religious at all? What makes music religious music? Is, for example, Bach's music religious? And if so, what makes it religious? Because Bach was a religious person? Because he took texts because the texts which he melodized he took from the Bible and the Christian tradition? Or is his music as such Christian or religious or spiritual, apart from the lyrics, apart from his personal religious attitude, in that he evokes religious feelings in the audience? So the reception makes it religious. I do not dare to give a clear answer. I cannot see a clear demarcation line between religious and secular music. For me, there is no music which is as such religions. Many songs of our hymn books in the churches originally were folk songs. They became religious because the lyrics were drawn from the Christian tradition. So I leave the question open for our discussion. What is there religious music? What makes it religious? In this context, another question I leave open in this context, reflection on the spatial issues are also important. I don't want to go deeper into that, but only hint into that direction, which is an important aspect, as I understand it, of our topic. And where is the music performed and where is it received? For the performance and the reception of the music, the space where it takes place plays an important role. It makes a difference if the same piece of music is presented in a church or in a public concert hall or on an open-air stage on the market square of a city. The space is the framing of the music and affects its reception and perception. But not even the space makes music to be religious or secular. As I understand it, it is only the attitude of the musicians and of the audience which makes the difference between religious and secular music. Now I leave the music, the question of whether music can be a means of interreligious communication for a while behind, and go further to regarding other non-verbal aesthetic media of interreligious relations, images, films, symbolic actions, and so. So it is the second part, music and art. Now I turn to this non-musical the forms of art. There's an interesting difference between music and those other aesthetic media. Those non-verbal aesthetic media, besides music, could and can be used not only to awaken and to promote interreligious understanding, but also to express polemical criticism and ridicule of other religious traditions. This too criticizing other religious traditions is also a form of interreligious relations and communication. I give you an example. The Cathedral of Bologna, the Basilica of San Petronio, is under strict police protection. Security forces are controlling the entrances day and night. Why? The reasons for that abundance of caution is a fresco from 1410 in a side chapel. It shows Mohammed in hell. The painter, Giovanni da Modena, was inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. In the 28th canto, it describes, the Divine Comedy describes how Mohammed, together with his son-in-law Ali, must atone in hell, in the 9th ditch of the 8th circle of hell, for the schism he caused. A demon slashes the body of the two. In 2001, the Muslim Union of Italy called on Pope John II and Cardinal Giacomo Biffi to remove the fresco from the cathedral, or from the chapel in the cathedral. And that drew a lot of public attention to the fresco. Before that it was not realized by many persons, but that drew the attention then to it. Presumably as a result of that, a terrorist cell of Al-Qaeda attempted to blow up the cathedral in 2002. But this and another attack in 2006 were thwarted, failed. Again and again, visual media are used to mock religious symbols and treat them with scorn. Visual media achieve a stronger effect on the recipients than texts and music. Numerous examples from the recent past could be listed. Many, however, do not fall into the category of interreligious relations, but to the category of secular criticism of religion, such as the Mohammed cartoons published by the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten at the end of 2005, which triggered protests among Muslims all over the world, as you may remember. On the other hand, visual media and performances can also be used to foster interreligious empathy and understanding. An example for such a positive impact visual art can have on interreligious understanding. I sketch briefly the impression a painting of Guido Reni had on Narvit Kermani. Guido Reni was an Italian painter, you may know that, of the Baroque period. He painted primarily religious works, but also mythological and allegorical subjects. One of his paintings shows the crucifixion of Jesus. It is located and displayed in the church San Lorenzo in Lucina in Rome. Narvit Kermani an Iranian Shia Muslim who lives in Germany, came as a tourist to visit that church. He regards the Christian theology of the cross as a blasphemy and idolatry. When he visited the church and was sitting in front of Guido Reni's painting, something strange happened to him. He found that picture, that painting, so enchanting, so full of blessings, that he couldn't stop looking at it. For the first time, he thought, not only one, I could believe in a cross. Reni does not transfigure the pain of Jesus. He does not even show it. His Jesus has no wounds. I should have shown you the painting. Perhaps you can't see it on the internet. The Jesus on the painting has no wounds. Even where his hands and feet are nailed on the cross, no blood flows. If the nails were not there, it would look as if he spreads his hands in prayer. He looks at the sky. The iris almost disappeared from the white of the eye. Look here, he seems to call. Not only look at me, but look at the earth, look at us. This is the impression Navid Kermani described. Jesus does not suffer to conciliate God. Instead, Jesus accuses God. Why have you abandoned us humans on earth? This Jesus is not the Son of God, Navid Kermani states, not even his messenger. He is a representative of humanity. His pain is not a physical one, not the consequence of inhuman tortures. It is a metaphysical pain. Jesus dies vicariously for all humans at any time, at any place. The painting had such a strong impact on Kermani. It made him think of an interpretation of the cross which is different from the Orthodox Christian teaching, and which he, as a Muslim, regarded not only as acceptable but as interreligiously important. That interpretation also can inspire Christian reflection on the meaning of the cross, and thus exert an impulse not only on the Christian-Muslim dialogue, but also on the dialogues within Christian theology. Visual media are not only paintings, it also includes architecture. Think of the impression visiting a Buddhist temple can have on the visitor, and the impression visiting a Gothic cathedral can have on a Buddhist. Think of the beauty of Islamic calligraphy and ornaments. The Prophet Muhammad once said, God is beautiful and he loves beauty. Think of the imagery of a Hindu temple, and so on. The self-understanding of religions is expressed in artifacts. Getting in touch with those artifacts is getting in touch with the core of the religion, of the religious tradition. Therefore, many initiatives which strive to promote interreligious encounters are drawing on aesthetic media. But again, I claim that it is not the medium in itself which promotes empathy and understanding, but the media as it is represented, as it is presented and received. There's another aspect which underscores the importance of the iconic besides the verbal communication, that is the role of the internet in contemporary communication practices. An increasingly large part of interreligious communication now takes place not in personal encounters, but in the digital space. And to a great extent, that communication is iconic, mediated by pictures and video clips. That meta-medium, the internet as a meta-medium, can be used to perform polemical but also dialogical interactions. The media itself and the forms of communication they make possible may have an influence on the intention and the style of communication, but I would say they are not the decisive factor for it. The decisive factor is the attitude, the disposition, the habitus of the person who uses those media. That attitude needs to be conveyed through education. It needs to become cultivated by experiences, and it needs to be practiced in interreligious encounters. Music and other aesthetic media can be very important means of promoting those processes, but their effects should not become exaggerated. Artistic approaches need to be combined with other forms of dialogue, such as theological discussions, political cooperation, grassroots initiatives, and so on. Theological and practical aesthetic expression can nurture each other. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions, discussion. Anybody would like to start?
Thank you very much. How do you train the habitus? How do you raise it? How do you nurture it? How do you make it effective in a culture? What education does it require? That's very important. How do we create that habitus?
That's a very important question. Of course, one can hope that that will happen in the families when the kids are small. That is the most important period of shaping their attitudes in the family. Then, of course, in schools, it's important to involve them into encounters with people, with other kids who are different from them, so that they can develop empathy for them. But if they are told at home those other kids are not to be accepted, then it's difficult to create such an attitude. So I hope very much that the families will not only teach it. It's not just the teaching; it's the shaping of the personality. So schools, of course, yeah, all the education system. But I think that the primary effects are coming from the families. That's what I would say. But maybe you have better questions. I left so many questions open for you. Give me answers.
Thank you very much. I would like maybe to challenge a question that you rose. You said, what makes music religious? And I would put it that way. When is music actually religious? And what I experienced in my research is that music becomes a religious act when actually the music, the text, and the musicking, in the sense of making music together, come together and act like something that becomes a performative act in a religious way. And then music might be a religious experience even for those who may not fully, let's say, agree with the content, but as a religious experience, whatever that means. Of course, I experienced that mainly in the Christian context. So people telling me, when we celebrate together and we sing a Christian song, then it's like saying a prayer. And it's not saying a prayer, but singing a prayer. And that makes it even a greater experience, which they would like to share with the people to have them to get a feeling what it means to actually pray in a religious and in a musical sense, maybe.
then again it is the act of praying together, by singing together. It's the act of connecting oneself with the sphere of the divine and with the community you are involved in. So is it the music itself, is it the experience, or is it both together in the act of the performance? This is what I would say. That makes the music religious. But the same piece of music can be non-religious in another context, in another way it is perceived.
Thank you very much for a most stimulating talk. Maybe we can say that there is no religious experience without artistic experience. And the connection between spiritual perception, or to be elevated spiritually, passes through art, however you want to call it. And that may be the reason for the rise of icons and liturgical music and whatever it is. So in this sense, any experience that has to do with stimulating the five senses in any way, whether sight, hearing, or maybe spiritual elevation, and this is the role of art, whether music or visual or whatever it is. And I do not think that religion is possible without art, whether music or for example, I take an example from Islam. Islam prohibits images, but the replacement of this is that calligraphy became an image itself. So the way they write the letters and the sentences is an artistic expression, maybe not in an image form, but in a semi-image form.
Yeah, and think of the recitation of the Quran, which is an artistic act. And you know, it is said that the beauty of the Quran, or the beauty of the language of the Quran, the beauty of the recitation of the Quran, is a proof of God. And I quoted Muhammad, that God is beautiful, that God loves beauty. Of course, and from the very beginning of the history of religions, religious, don't know whether one can say beliefs, are expressed in a symbolic way. Another question is, can we call that art, or should there be a distinction between art and religious symbolism? Another open question.
I want to add thank you for the talk, it's very interesting. I want to add from the neuroscience that we need the group experience for the energy, and with music we can have in the brain the nearly same feeling. So this is what the art is, and with beauty we know that intercultural, what is beautiful, everybody sees. So it's not difficult to see it from different eyes. So I think it's a uniform energy, or I don't know, it's religious or what we look for, the light or the energy or the collective feeling.
But that means the effect of the standing in front of the Mona Lisa in the Louvre is quite the same than standing in front of the Guido's crucifixion. So then in that respect, there is no difference between religious and other forms of arts. The effect is the same then.
But in a group feeling.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just wondering how you would respond to. I'm a Catholic, and I'm thinking of Vatican II, and I was just reading about the sacred liturgy today, and the decree that asked Catholics to make sure that Gregorian chant took pride of place in the liturgy. And I started to look at that more deeply, and the reasons were for that were that the angels taught Gregorian chant to the monks. Would you consider that just a sort of legend or hagiography, or would you be open to the notion that that is what would distinguish secular music from religious music, this openness to the divine?
can you determine it, whether it's open to the divine? Someone says a piece of secular music is also opening my heart to the divine. Can that happen? So a song of joy or whatever. So what opens the heart for the divine? Is it a certain way of composing music, performing music, receiving music? Or is it just that we are so familiar with the tradition, for example, of that style of music that we associate it as religious music or associate with religious music and say, well, then we are joining the choir of angels when we hear or sing it. Then it's not just an issue of touching the heart, but maybe of understanding their own tradition on a rather intellectual way. I don't know.
Any other questions, or we go back, final question to the person who started?
Yes, I wanted to share with Professor Bernhard the two examples from Lebanese culture where I am aware, which I'm aware of, that have something of what you said. And the first is this a cappella choir called Al-Fayha. It's an a cappella choir that sings secular music. But oftentimes it introduces religious music, both Christian and Muslim, as if to say there is no boundary, there is no fence between what is secular and what is sacred. But I don't know how to measure how effective that type of performance is in an interreligious setting. That's number one model, and I recommend that one looks at this Fayha choir on the internet, because they have their performances recorded there. And the second one is what we celebrate annually in Lebanon, Annunciation Day, where Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the center of that celebration. And both Muslims and Christians celebrate together that day. And music is, or has been introduced as a means to celebrate this interreligious national activity now in Lebanon. So these are two examples that I can share with you about our context where music can be used as a medium, or has been used as a medium for, but I don't know how to measure its impact, its effectiveness, its appeal. I don't know.
But which music is played then at that Annunciation Day?
Religious music.
Which religious music? Christian?
Christian and Muslim.
There is a...
It's blended into one.
Yes, one chants Allahu Akbar, the Muslim, and Ave Maria is sung. Both together, harmonized to a certain extent. That takes place on that day. Okay, one more question.
I want to ask in the discourse about wonder in religious, that we have wonder. And I think when we have complexity like religious, or what we discuss in life, in music we can also find a wonder. We have an idea about what we can join, but I cannot tell you what happened, what we do. And this kind of wonder in complex situation, I think is I think we are interested, like here all in this situation, to understand what we are and what is the religion plays a role. And so this is like a connection for me. I don't know if you can follow this theory.
As I understood the question, it was whether there's a kind of miraculous dimension in it. I called it a magic power in the music itself. I doubt, but maybe that's my problem, because I'm not who was it, Max Weber called, what was his term? I had a wonderful expression for that. Sorry, it escaped my mind. I'm not so talented in music, and maybe so I cannot feel this magical power of the music. Maybe others among us are much more open to music, and they would tell a different story than I did. Now I had the term religious virtuosis. Is it? You understand? Is it correct English?
Virtuoso, the one who performs, you mean?
Yeah.
Virtuoso.
Religioso, virtuoso, he called it. And I'm not a musical virtuoso.
Well, thank you once again, Professor Reinhardt, and thank you for coming. And please join us for a cup of coffee or tea, and maybe continue conversation.